There's an article here by 538 explaining that Clinton's leading in exactly the state she needs to win, but yet she still only has a 60% chance of winning. So she has at least a 70% chance of winning in every single one of those states, but she has only a 60% chance of winning. We're actually really close to a point of agreement. If I was to go through the article and read it, and I'm not going to disagree with much of what he says in that article. I'm just questioning, and this is the same old argument that I've been pushing the whole time. I question the idea that the margins cited are nearly as meaningful as suggested, especially between Ohio and Pennsylvania, which have often voted differently, right? So what he's doing is he's saying, well, look, white people are voting for Trump in Ohio, so if there's white people in Pennsylvania, then the people in Ohio and Pennsylvania should, if they're both white and working class, they should vote about the same. I'm saying, no, that's not good logic. What I'm saying is that if the data says that people in Ohio are voting different than people in Pennsylvania, then people in Ohio and Pennsylvania are not the same, even if they're both white. And I think that if you look at the history, Pennsylvania is not a swing state. Pennsylvania is a safe democratic state, whereas Ohio, if anything, tends to lean Republican, right? And the difference is that the urban population and Philadelphia mostly, but also Pittsburgh, is very democratic leaning, right? It's just the same question of demographics being predictive or not, which I reject. I don't think it means anything to say if there are white people in Ohio, then white people in Pennsylvania should be the same. I think it's more important to say, okay, people in Ohio are one thing. Let's look at Ohio and Ohio's history and Ohio's demographic, and then look at Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania's history and Pennsylvania's demographic, instead of taking similarities and taking data from one state and trying to apply it to the other. I'm saying no, you should model each state separately as a completely different entity. Because I think that these are independent variables. I think that technically speaking, I don't think anybody's gonna. See, you have to be a little bit pragmatic about what you have in front of you, right? I don't think anybody's going to disagree with what I'm saying if you sit them down, but they might argue that they don't really have the data to follow through with it, so they're making, they're compromising based on what they have in front of them, right? You can only analyze the data that you have. You can't make data up that doesn't exist. I'm a statistician, I'm not a pollster. I don't have money to commission polls. I can take the data that exists and play with it and try to use it to, come up with things, but I don't generate the data myself, right? And if we had enough data to model Ohio and to model Pennsylvania, then I would. Well, you know what? I think that argument works okay if you're talking about Idaho or Utah or Montana. I actually think we do have enough data to model Ohio separately, and we do have enough data to model Pennsylvania separately. And when you look at the situation, you say, gee, it seems like white people in Ohio are voting for Trump by 4 or 5% more. That doesn't make sense to me. They're both white. Aren't all white people the same? Maybe that's the block, right? Maybe instead of looking at the information and saying, this empirical data does not fit my assumptions, maybe you should look at it and say, my assumptions are not being upheld by the empirical data. That maybe white people in Ohio and white people in Pennsylvania aren't the same thing. And again, I just have to wonder aloud how anybody could agree that it's almost certain that she's going to win at least 270 electoral votes. And the argument is that She's so far ahead in all of these states that she couldn't possibly get less. But yet you're much less certain that she's going to win the election. I know what happens when you multiply probabilities out, okay, but if it isn't a contradiction, okay, it's at least cognitive dissonance. I've pointed this out a few times, right? It's not always the best idea to just run through formulas, to just plug things in. Sometimes you need to take a step back and say to yourself, does that make sense? And if it doesn't, maybe you might want to question how valid. See, again, math, we're stuck in this kind of Kantian concept of math, right? Math is not a language of the universe. Probability theory does not describe how things are. Math is simply a model. Math itself is a model. It's a model to try to describe things. And probability theory is, the least. If I'm going to rank different types of math as being, most grounded in reality, probability theory is going to be kind of somewhere near the bottom there. We can come up with these ratios and everything else, but there's no reason why our ratios are binding on things. You can come up with your calculations and say there's a 99% chance that something's going to happen. Guess what? The universe doesn't really give a fuck what your numbers say, right? You're not describing a physical law, you're just measuring numbers and ratios. And this is kind of the great lie of probabilities, right? The actual truth. I mean, we think of probability theory the same way we think of physics. But we know gravity exists. We might not really be entirely sure what it is, but we know it's there, right? We know there's an attraction between masses. There is no such law to use for probability theory. We have laws of numbers. But we don't have physical laws that we can use to, that we can apply, right? So these numbers you come up with, they might look impressive. They don't actually really mean anything, right? And so when you come up with the situation where you're like, well, we can see that she has at least a 75% chance of winning every single one of these states, and yet we calculate that she only has a 60% chance of winning. Again, I know how the math works. I know what happens when you multiply probabilities. But that isn't actually rationally consistent with itself, is it? Again, I'm just saying that you need to take a step back sometimes and look at what you're doing. It might not always make sense. Even if using the best formulas, okay? If you can let me be a little bit Trumpish for a minute. You got the best formulas. Formulas are great. It doesn't always come up with a good result. Again, like I said, nobody's gonna really seriously argue that Ohio and Pennsylvania are independent. But all the models have a kind of a dependency, one way or the other, right? And when you measure something and it challenges your assumptions, you should conclude that your assumptions are wrong, not that the measurement's wrong. even if that means acknowledging that maybe your assumptions are kind of racist, right? Again, this isn't, go back and look, I've been ranting about this for months. It's the same basic point. And who knows, maybe he'll fluke out again. If he does, I'll have an explanation, you can be sure of it. But I'm sorry, okay? I don't see any reason at all to suggest that if white people in Ohio were voting for Trump, therefore white people in Pennsylvania should vote for Trump. There's no, the historical record that we have completely rejects that. Because Ohio is a swing state and Pennsylvania is not. Okay?